Is where I left off on my last presentation. I want to really emphasize here that when evolution began, certain species were able to survive and reproduce while others were not as successful, and the less successful species went extinct while the more successful species continued on. This is a very true statement that nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. I'm hoping over the course of this year, you'll continue to see this theme that there's a common heredity, a common descent of all creatures. It really is the best explanation for all of the similarities you see between all of the different groups of life, which is the main topic of this video. All of the organisms, every single thing that we know of that's alive today, uses the same group of macromolecules. Now, the ones that were originally alive are no longer around. They've gone extinct. If there had been other forms of self-replicating molecules, which I mentioned in the last video is pretty much how life began, something like RNA was able to start making copies of itself. Then it was able to make better versions of certain molecules to make cellular processes happen. It was able to replace, RNA was able to replace certain functions with proteins, which do a much better job because they can take on a whole bunch of different other forms. And then DNA ended up taking over as the main hereditary coding material in living things. That all dates back to what we have as a last universal common ancestor. It means it was the ancestor of everything that is alive today. That species is no longer around. Neither are other living life forms, which may have used other macromolecules. They may have existed, but they weren't as successful as those that are still alive today. The last universal common ancestor still wasn't the best at doing the job of making copies of itself, of utilizing different molecules for its own benefit, building polymers from monomers. The last universal common ancestor was very good at doing that, but it wasn't the best. Over time, species have gotten better at doing that since that time. There's a continual evolution. We can't think that just because all of these species are around today, they've all been continuing to evolve from an initial last universal common ancestor. I'll discuss what prokaryotes mean, but really it has to do with the nucleus. Eukaryotes have a nucleus, prokaryotes do not. But that's not to say that bacteria or archaea, which I'll mention, are any less successful than the eukaryotes. We tend to think, because humans are animals, we tend to think that we are the most advanced forms of life. However, bacteria have kept evolving since ancient times. So have archaea kept evolving since ancient times. So have plants, so have animals, so have fungi. So the animals and plants and fungi and archaea and bacteria that we see alive today aren't the same ones that were alive millions of years ago or billions of years ago, because life has been evolving all that time. Life has been improving over all that time. The earliest organisms weren't as good at exploiting resources like the organisms that are alive today. And that's why bacteria have continued to be evolving, archaea have continued to be evolving, and eukaryotes have continued to be evolving. But all of these come from an ancestor that was able to displace any other possible life forms that may have used molecules different than proteins, nucleic acids, carbohydrates, and fats. The first domain we will look at are the eubacteria, also called the true bacteria. Just to be clear, one organism is called a bacterium. More than one is called bacteria. So you would have a bacterium, many bacteria. They are prokaryotes, which means they do not have a nucleus, although their DNA is usually in a special region of the cell called the nucleoid, but it's not surrounded by a membrane like a membrane in eukaryotes would be. It's one circular chromosome. I'll talk a little bit more about the structure, but the structure is one basic long loop. Now, the loop may be twisted in over itself, but the eukaryotes have a one strand of DNA, a linear strand, whereas the eubacteria have a circular or a loop that's twisted and twisted and twisted, but it is one loop of DNA, which is located in a region called the nucleoid, not the nucleus. They may have shapes as rods, which are basically this shape, a sphere, which you would probably know as a circle, or a spiral, which is kind of a twisted corkscrew type shape. Their cell walls are made of something called peptidoglycan, which are polysaccharides. So we see these are the polysaccharides. And then we have polypeptides, also glycine, 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 lysine, alanine, glutamate. So they have different amino acids that are part of this structure of their cell wall. Cell walls are one way that we separate different types of living things. Plants have a cell wall also, but it's made of entirely different material than the cell wall of bacteria. And we can see here the cell wall. In certain bacteria, it's protected by a membrane on the outside, while there's others, they only have the membrane on the inside and then the cell wall on the outside. You'll see a little bit more of that when we do our diagrams of bacteria, which are coming up shortly. The Archaea tend to be very unusual organisms. They were originally classified as a type of bacteria because they are single-celled. They are prokaryotes. They do not have a nucleus. They tend to live in very extreme places. Acidophile, that philia means loving, like hydrophilic, for example. So an acidophile would love acid conditions. A thermophile would love heat conditions. Halophile would love salty conditions. That's where we find a lot of the Archaea. They have genes. Certain parts of their DNA look a lot like eukaryotes, although they have very strange cell membranes. So it's possible that Archaea may have come from a early organism that was able to replicate its DNA but did not have the same cell membrane as bacteria and eukaryotes, which have very similar cell membranes, which we'll look a little more in detail when we look at the parts of the cell. Archaea also are able to use many unusual energy sources such as hydrogen, ammonia. They may also use sugars. That's not so unusual. Everyone else uses sugars as well. But these are possibly creatures that could live in conditions that are very similar to what we might find on other planets. We could potentially find something like an Archaea on Mars or on one of the moons of Saturn called Titan, which has hydrogen available in the atmosphere. Eukaryotes are the ones that are most familiar to us. When we drew the cells during class, we know that eukaryotes have a nucleus. They also have a lot of specialized organelles like the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, the lysosomes, all of these things that are important, which we'll look in more detail when we look more in detail at the cell. There are 3 kingdoms that are mostly multicellular. Most fungi are made of more than one cell, although yeast are a type of fungi that are made of only one cell. Animalia, they're all multicellular. And then the Plantae, which are the also largely multicellular group. Protists are the kind of the catch bag, as you'll see, where we don't really know. Some of them are more closely related to fungi, some are more closely related to animals, some are more closely related to plants, but they are all basically different types of one-celled organisms. All of the eukaryotes have many different organelles inside of their cytoplasm, and then they have the nucleus where the DNA is stored. The protists are the catch-all. These are mostly unicellular organisms. Some of them are more plant-like, some of them are more fungus-like, as I showed you here. Some are more animal-like, but the protists are basically all the unicellular organisms we can't put as a plant, a fungus, or an animal. You might have things like amoebas, paramecia, which I'm hoping we'll see under a microscope, euglena, dinoflagellates, slime molds, and then some people would say brown algae, red algae, which are very large multicellular organisms, but they don't fit as plants, they don't fit as animals, they don't fit as fungi, so oftentimes they're either put into their own separate kingdoms or they're included as protists because they just don't fit anywhere else. Plants, I think we're more familiar with. They get energy through photosynthesis, which we'll look at more in detail. They tend to be mostly green. Even a Venus flytrap will get its energy from photosynthesis. Although there are very few exceptions to this where you have some plants that have actually lost their chlorophyll. They've lost their chloroplasts. They don't do photosynthesis, but their ancestors did, and therefore they're still classified as plants. This, which is called the Indian pipe flower, this does have cellulose in its cell walls. It doesn't have chloroplasts anymore, but it did have them. It doesn't have chlorophyll anymore, but it did have it at one point in its past. While all others have a cell wall made of cellulose, and they have their chloroplasts and chlorophyll. Most plants are also multicellular. Fungi are what we would call heterotrophic, which means they need to get their food from something else. Autotrophs make their food from photosynthesis or some other process where they're able to make their own food, whereas fungi, and as you'll see, animals, need to get their food from another source. Fungi have cell walls. Remember I said that bacteria have a cell wall made of peptidoglycan. Plants have a cell wall made of cellulose. Fungi have cell walls made of chitin, which is another carbohydrate, although you would see there are some nitrogens sticking off of the sugar rings of the carbohydrates. Fungi generally reproduce with spores, which aren't exactly seeds, but they're very, very tiny packages of DNA and protein and other substances, other macromolecules that would enable a fungus to be able to make a copy of itself and reproduce. Fungi also, in general, have more similarities with animals than with plants. When we classify, if I can go back to my diagram here, fungi are more closely related to animals than either are to plants. When I was in school, I learned that fungi were what we called non-green plants, but over the years, especially as we've come to understand DNA a lot better, it turns out that fungi and animals are much more closely related and share a common ancestor, which was some sort of a one-celled organism that lived much more recently than plants, which are much more distant descendants of animals and fungi. Going back ahead, we do have a few unicellular fungi, which are the yeast, very important for making bread, very important for fermenting many different drinks that adults might consume. Yeast are definitely very important for a lot of different human activities, and they are one-celled fungi. They probably were at one point some sort of a multicellular organism. They actually went back to becoming unicellular. And I'm hoping we'll get to work with some yeast this year. Then we have the animals. I didn't realize that some of these pictures were animated. But animals, heterotrophic. I think you know what eukaryotic means. It means that they have a nucleus. Multicellular. All animals are multicellular. Even sponges, which we might see here. Corals, which we might see here. Fish, all multicellular. They have a lot of specialized tissues, which are cell layers, with the exception of the sponges. They're related to a group of protists called choanoflagellates, which are sometimes single-celled, sometimes they are kind of a clump of cells that will live together. This is kind of the very first basic path into becoming a sponge, and then from a sponge onto something like a jellyfish or a coral or a more complex animal, to finally getting to the much more complex creatures that we see around us, which we would call animals. Another thing about the DNA of animals, they have these HOX genes, which control the pattern of how a body is developed. Very important that everything turns out in exactly the right spot where you need it for an animal. And we have these very important genes called HOX genes, which control that. One of the first HOX genes to be discovered was called sonic hedgehog, which is a strange name for a gene. It was discovered because it was in a fruit fly. One fruit fly that had a damaged gene or a mutated gene actually had a lot of spikes on its body instead of having a normal fly pattern, and therefore the person who discovered it thought it looked like Sonic the Hedgehog, and then called the DNA that was mutated from that Sonic Hedgehog gene. Some people might ask about viruses. Viruses do reproduce. They can't do it by themselves, though. If I have a virus, any one of these viruses sitting around in a test tube, for example, it can't make copies of itself until it invades the cell of another organism. So there are viruses that will attack the cells of animals. There are viruses that attack plants. There are viruses that attack fungi. There are viruses that attack bacteria and archaea. In every case, the virus has to invade the cell of another organism, and then it can make copies of itself and reproduce. Viruses do definitely evolve. HIV is one virus known to evolve very, very rapidly. Some viruses, such as the pox virus, which we see here, or I believe this is a flu virus, does have... Oh, no, that's a coronavirus. That's a little RNA virus, sorry. The pox viruses do have DNA in them. This is called white spot syndrome. It's on a crayfish. That's another virus, very unusual, strange virus. It does only attack crustaceans like shrimp and crabs and lobsters. It's another DNA virus. One thing to remember is that none of these viruses have a metabolism. They do not break down sugars for energy, as we will explore with all the other living things. Bacteria break down something to make energy. Archaea break down something to make energy. Plants will make sugars, but then they also break those sugars down to make energy. But in all of these cases, they have a metabolism, which viruses do not. Some viruses do have a membrane on the outside of their structure. Some of them just have proteins on the outside of their structure. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they're alive when they don't have all of the macromolecules that we generally associate with life. And as we said, they do have some sort of coding nucleic acid, although that could be RNA, or it also could be DNA. All domains, the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukaryote, are all affected by viruses, different kinds of viruses. Where the viruses come from is still somewhat open to debate, but they are a very unusual group of self-replicating molecules that need to invade other cells to make copies of themselves. Should we count them alive? They don't have all the characteristics of life that we've talked about in class, but they are kind of spanning the halfway point between something that's non-living and something that's living. In most cases, viruses will only infect one species or a very closely related species. HIV, for example, originally came from a virus that infected monkeys, and through the bushmeat trade, where people were hunting monkeys and cutting them up and accidentally cutting themselves and getting monkey blood on their cuts, HIV jumped from monkeys to people. The same thing happened. There's actually two kinds of HIV. That's the HIV-1. That's the more prevalent one. There's also an HIV-2, which is in chimpanzees. So most primates, or most of our closest relative, apes or monkeys, would possibly be susceptible to an HIV sort of a virus. In HIV-2, chimpanzees actually don't die from the disease. They get it. They live with it. Humans, it tends to be a little bit more dangerous, where people can actually die from it. In most cases, though, no other mammals are going to get the HIV virus. Outside of apes and monkeys, our closest relatives, a cow won't get HIV, a cat won't get HIV. We don't get viruses from cats generally, except for rabies, which is one of those viruses that tends to infect a whole wide range of warm-blooded mammals. White spot syndrome virus is another very strange virus that can infect a huge group of animals, which we call a clade. I'll talk more about that when we get to classification systems for animals. Here we have one other type of virus. So this is a very simple virus with the proteins in the capsid. It has a RNA internal. This is the poliovirus. It has an RNA on the inside, no DNA. So that's already not meeting all the requirements of life that we defined earlier. But these are kind of that halfway point between something living and non-living, the viruses. That doesn't mean to say viruses aren't important. Of course, they're very important to living things. And a lot of the tools, when we talk about genetic engineering a little bit later on, a lot of the tools for genetic engineering actually came from viruses. Viruses are very fascinating objects. We can't really call them living things. We can't call them organisms, but they are very fascinating in general. With that, we're finished for this presentation, and I hope to get a lot more deeper investigation into the parts of different kinds of cells, whether they be bacteria, plants, animals, or fungi, very soon. Thank you.